thanks very much for coming. Actually, I'm not a faculty member at Berkeley, but I assume that I am because I have a British accent. But no, I just get by sounding like Hugh Grant. Gosh. So, yeah, food riots. Well, briefly, just what I'm going to do is explain what happened last year, why there were protests around the world, and why it's important to call them food rebellions, or at least to have the idea of rebellion in your mind rather than riot. Because if you watch the news, what you would have seen is, sort of journalists running around with their cameras, and the journalists always arrive too late. Right? So all they see is the sort of burning tire in the middle of the road, and the journalist will sort of wax rhapsodic about the poor people. They were running through the street, and they were sort of trying to smash windows, grabbing food wherever they could. Yeah, the idea being that what happens in a food riot is that the poor people of the world are reduced to two organs, sort of growling stomachs and clenched fists. And that's all they are. They're these sort of animal passions that run through the streets seeking food. But the argument I want to make is that what happens in a food rebellion is way more political. And in any case, whenever you hear of spontaneous riots, you should always be very, very suspicious, because as community organisers, we all know, nothing's spontaneous. It takes forever to organise a spontaneous So when you hear of these spontaneous, hungry people in the street, you know that there's something else going on. So what I want to do is just sort of run through the reasons why we had the food price spike last year, and then link that to why there were protests. So last year, then President, no longer President George Bush, we can have a little cheer there if you like, there were food prices doubling, the price of rice went up by 30% in a single day. Prices went up many fold last year. And George Bush was reluctantly, he answered a question about why this was happening. And what he said was, those Indians, the middle class, when those 150 million people, when they start getting rich, they start demanding things. Now, one of his aides stepped in and filled in the gaps for the president. What the president was arguing was that because people in the developing world, particularly in India, now had more money, what they were doing was demanding more food, and that was driving the price of food up. You could blame India for the increase in food prices, and it wasn't just India. In particular, what George Bush was arguing was that in India people were demanding more meat, and so the food crisis last year, according to the president, was really about meat, about millions of Indians suddenly deciding that what they wanted was a hamburger. Now, I don't know if many of you are familiar with India, but we're a Hindu lot, right? So there wasn't a sort of Big Mac. No, never happened. But what? It's a good enough place to start off investigating why the price of food went up. Because certainly, the meat industry does have a lot to do with with driving up the price of grain. When it's sort of 6-7 times the amount of grain in terms of weight is used to make a pound of beef, for example. 7 pounds of grain for a pound of beef, for instance. And of course, that's going to have an effect on driving up the price of meat. But the country that consumes the most meat is not India; it's here. You would need 7 planets to provide enough grain to sustain the meat production that the average American needs. But that was a certain kind of misdirection. There were other reasons why the price of food went up last year. One of them was biofuels. I mentioned this earlier on, the idea that you grow food to set it on fire. That's what biofuels are. And in every way, biofuels are a mad policy. They are not environmentally sustainable. They require more energy to make them than you get by releasing them. But last year was an election year. And in an election year, it's better to burn American corn than it is to burn Saudi oil. So the price of biofuels drove the price of grain up. Because when you grow biofuels, you grow corn, and the federal government said, we're going to buy all the corn that anyone can shake a stick at. So farmers quite reasonably said, right, well, we're going to switch to corn. So what does that do? First, that takes wheat, land that was being used to grow wheat, takes that out of production. So the price of wheat goes up. And then because there's less corn to eat, the price of corn goes up. And then, as a result of the price of corn going up, the price of substitutes go up. So in the US, yellow corn was being used to make ethanol. But there's a substitute, and that's white corn. And in Mexico, white corn, the price of white corn was more or less controlled by one company, by Archer Daniels Midland. They speculated on the price of corn, they drove the price of white corn way up. And that's why we saw in 1997, as a result of US biofuels policy, 2007, as a result of US biofuels policy, tortilla riots in Mexico City. Now, what that was about was not people just saying, tortilla, price of corn's going crazy, but instead it was about a specific critique of government. Whenever you see a food rebellion, it's about not only a demand for food, but also about a sudden gap between what you believe is your right and what you are able to buy with your food dollars. Right? I mean, we've seen hunger throughout the world, but you see the riots, you see the protests, when there's this sudden increase in a gap between what people believe is their right and what they're able to afford. Right? So this expectations gap is an integral part of the idea of a food riot. And so I want to use that idea to get to a couple of food riots that I think were tremendously important in history. One of them, of course, is the Haitian riot, where all we saw was the smouldering tires, but in fact, what Haitians were in the streets demanding was a return of Jean-Bertrand Aristide, the president who was thrown out of that country by George Bush. Kidnapped, and then thrown out. I mean, this isn't something that appeared on our radar screens. It was never reported that actually there were very politically articulated demands behind the food protest. Instead, what we had was just, Haitians, they're going crazy again, they're mad. And I think the way to understand that is to understand a food riot that happened here. I know I've come to you've heard this before, but the example I want to end with, because I think it shows what's important about the food rebellion, is the food rebellion that happened in the United States, in this city, in 1917. Now, in 1917, we had a food price hike at the end of the First World War. There was a spike in the price of food across America. And the people whose job it was to put food on the table, well, they couldn't. Those people invariably were women. But in 1917, women didn't have the right to vote. There was no way that women could write to their elected representative and complain about the price of food, because they had no elected representatives. And in 1917, there were already great forces of political organizing, usually in this city, socialist women's groups, who were organizing women not only for the vote, for the franchise, but also for control over the economy. And that's why, in 1917, women took to the streets in what were called food riots, but were in fact a series of very carefully calibrated and articulated demands, not only for food that was affordable to everyone, but also for the right to engage in politics, for the right to a politics. And that's what food rebellions are. That's what we lose when we call them food riots, is that food rebellions are a demand for a right to politics. And that, I think, is maybe the key idea here, that in all the movements around the world that are fighting for food, they're fighting for a right to politics. What the World Bank does is come in and depoliticize. What the USDA does is come in and render technocratic, make it just a technical, expert-driven decision about how we're going to have our food or not. And what food rebellions are a symptom of is people taking that back the right to a politics. And it works. I mean, this is the sort of dark secret about food rebellions, is that they do work. Because what happened in 1917, as a result of the food protests here, in Philadelphia, in Boston and Chicago, the 19th Amendment was passed, and women were allowed to vote in this country because of food rebellions. So I think that story is where I want to end, because I think it shows the great promise there is in community organizing. The great promise that food rebellions offer, but only if we're aware that they're not mad riots of the senseless, but actually carefully organized cries of people demanding their politics back. Thanks very much.